within your pricing group, your organization, think about the customer experience and how price plays into it, and how do you innovate on that?
Coffee's for closers only.
So we've established my proposal is sound in principle. Now we're just haggling over price.
Let's see how much we're going for on eBay.
Man, it's the same as Dunkin' Donuts. Costs 15 times the price.
Welcome to Impact Pricing, the podcast where we discuss pricing, value, and the fast-moving relationship between them. I'm Mark Stiving. Today our guest is Craig Zawada once again. Here are 3 things you want to know about Craig before we start. He was at McKinsey for 13 years, ended up leading their North American pricing practice. He's co-author of The Price Advantage, one of the seminal books in pricing, and he is the Chief Visionary Officer at Pros. One day, I want to be a Chief Visionary Officer. Welcome, Craig.
Hey, Mark, good to see you again.
Good to see you too. So you got this new white paper out titled Winning in Turbulent Times, the Strategic Imperative for Smarter Digital Selling Amid Unprecedented Volatility. First, did you write that title or did somebody else do it?
I think I had some help on that. I can only do a few words, so.
So let's, so last time you and I talked, we talked a lot about digitalization and what that meant and how we do that. We're going to go a little bit deeper into it today based on this white paper. And by the way, we'll post a link to the white paper in the show notes, and I'm sure we can get it on the Pros website and things like that. So let's start with what is volatility and where are we seeing all this volatility coming from right now?
Yeah, Mark, volatility is something that's not new. I think any business has dealt with volatility in the past, like maybe a new competitor came in, or there was a downturn across the board or a particular area, or there were some supply disruptions, so cost volatility that was happening. And I think when we started to talk with a number of our customers and prospects and companies out there, what we found is that what was unique to this environment is many companies are facing all 3 of these simultaneously. So as an example, on the demand volatility, so you have different openings across regions, and so demand is variable, or across product categories. In some cases, if you're a distributor, some product categories were increasing, like sanitation, protective equipment, and other things were going down in a spiral. So demand volatility. From a competitive volatility, what we find is a lot of competitors out there, they're in different positions. So they have differential needs for cash. They have different strategies. Some of our customers said, we're strong, we have a strong balance sheet, we're going to use this to try to gain share. Others are like, we need to preserve cash. So you have competitive volatility. And then on the cost side, similar, a lot of these have pushed through of needing to deal with, for example, the volatility in oil or commodity prices. And so what we find is that a lot of companies, in this environment are saying, well, how do we maintain our relevance, right? What's our strategy in the demand fluctuation? How do we respond to competitors? Are they actually taking share from us, or is it demand, or is it competition? So having visibility on all these things and coming up with a strategy, it's sort of like juggling multiple balls at once, really increase the need for the pricing organizations and discipline to really step up and try to get that visibility, develop the strategies, and then execute those strategies very quickly within their business.
Yeah, I have this really hard question that I want to ask you, but I don't think our listeners will understand it yet until we talk about a little bit about digitalization and this concept that you write in the paper and we talked about last time, where companies and buyers are moving more towards, I want my price delivered digitally instead of negotiated. So say that way better than I just did. Would you please?
Yeah, so, and this was a trend that we saw happening in 2019, and it's really accelerated over the last 6 or so months, which is, if you look at a lot of the buying and selling, and I'm talking primarily on B2B, right? Many companies that were selling and companies that were buying relied upon this long process, right? So I want to make sure as a buyer I'm getting a good price. So I'm going to put all my suppliers through this process where I'm going to do RFPs, I'm going to get quotes, and I'm not going to accept that. I'm going to play them off against one another. And it's a very long process, but the buyers felt that they needed to do this because they didn't trust, right, the sellers. And the sellers also, they wanted to maintain the ability to price differentiate between different situations. And so, it was this process that has grown from over the years. And what we find is that many companies, they have just too much of their business in that high touch negotiation that's happening. And we've seen this trend happen in 2019 where buyers, they know that algorithms are out there, they're assessing these things automatically, and they're saying, hey, why don't, instead of going through this long process, can't you just give me a market relevant price and I'll determine whether that's fair or not and decide to buy from you. So and this was a trend that's been happening, totally accelerated due to COVID-19, where now, I don't have time to go through this process. And so as a supplier, you have to have the ability to deliver a market relevant price immediately, not just putting a list price out there. It has to be a market relevant price. And on the buyer side, they don't want to go through this long process. And I'm not saying it's, across the board, everything, but a larger percentage of the transactions we see are going to move to that no-touch, self-serve environment. And unfortunately, a lot of pricing organizations aren't ready for that, right? So they'll go through a digital process and they'll say, okay, what's our price? Oh, let's put the list price on because we want to maintain this price umbrella. But buyers are saying, okay, if it's unrealistic, I'm not even going to call you because I have another supplier that I can get a market relevant price that's out there. Now, the good news is they're willing to pay a premium for that. And we've researched this through surveys as well as through our empirical evidence with our customers. So if you put a market relevant price out there that's easy to get, immediately available, they'll actually pay a little bit of premium for that versus going through this long negotiated process, because that takes time and money.
Yep.
Does that make sense?
Okay. It makes a ton of sense. And that's actually what I want to spend a bunch of time talking about today is when does it make sense? When doesn't it make sense? But now I want to come back to the really hard question. Okay. We talked about 3 areas of variability, volatility. And now we're talking about taking out the manual process of talking to customers and negotiating prices. It almost seems like that's backwards, where the more volatility there is, the more I need to be talking to my customers, and I can only do digitalization when it's more stable. So go ahead and correct my thinking on that.
All right, Mark, it's a good question, but I think the challenge now is, moving towards a no-touch digital self-serve pricing doesn't mean you do that without a read on the market. Right. The challenge, though, is you have to have that read on the market before you touch the customer. Right? You have to determine, okay, if I'm selling server hardware in France, okay, what's the demand supply situation? What's the competitive price? Okay, I have a good idea of what that winning price is. So what that requires is you have to have the tentacles out there with the data to be able to make those decisions without necessarily talking to the customer. Now, of course, when you talk, getting feedback and that is useful, but often it's too late. So what I'm saying is it doesn't necessarily mean that you don't have a read on what's happening, but increasingly you have to be able to interpret those signals. First of all, you have to be collecting these signals and then be able to interpret and build those into your actual prices in a much quicker way than, in this environment in the past that has been more static, and you can take time, and, the customers are used to that. It's a much more static environment in the past. So you increasingly have to have the ability to do that before you ever talk to the customer.
So then the volatility has less to do with the digitalization or the self-serve pricing, and it has more to do with having the data and awareness of what's going on in these 3 different areas and making adjustments as quickly as possible on our side, on the seller side.
Yeah, yeah, I think that's right. And these things they happen together, but they're not necessarily related. So all the volatility on demand, cost, and competition, a lot of that was affected by COVID. But the digital aspect of it, that was a trend that was happening, right? And now that's just been accelerated. So really, I call it the volatility trifecta, but really there's four things happening. You have the volatility trifecta plus this movement to digital and self-service.
Yeah. Okay, awesome. Let's talk about this movement to digital and self-service then. And I want to look at it from both the buyer's perspective and the seller's perspective. And so let's start with the seller's side for a second. And to make my life easy, I'm going to assume digitalization means I'm selling on Amazon to consumers. Now, I get it, you guys do B2B, but that just is a nice analogy that helps me think through what we're talking about. Is that fair?
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, that's fair. Although I would define it in two ways. There's one, we call it no touch, and then low touch, right? So no touch means I don't know who you are, right? I'm putting a price that's out there. I don't know who you are. From a B2B perspective, low touch means you come to the website. I know, say I'm a office products distributor. You've bought from me from the past. I have your agreement loaded in, right? And so I know something about you, and now I want to buy something off agreement. So that's more common in the B2B environment, which is a little bit different than Amazon, where, in a lot of cases, it's a purely anonymous price. So I wanted to, because there is an important distinction here.
Yeah, I think that's totally fair. Although it wouldn't surprise me if Amazon knows who I am, and every time I go shop there, they charge me more than they charge anybody else. So, but besides that, let's talk about the seller side for a second. When does it make sense for a seller to want to put prices, no touch or low touch prices out, versus having a salesperson negotiate directly? Now, I certainly have some thoughts, but let's just open it up to you. And what do you think?
Yeah, I think, and I want to make a generalization here, Mark, which is in most businesses, I would say 15 to 20% maximum should be a protracted negotiation process where these are big deals, multi-year, it's meaningful to the supplier and super meaningful to the buyer, that transaction. So most B2B companies, there's always going to be this portion of the business, which is, the big deals that happen. And then you have the category of repeat purchases. So they're already a customer, they're purchasing, I'm updating prices, or they're buying something that I haven't negotiated. They want to buy something else. A lot of that could be automated to self-serve. New customers coming in, registering. So an example on waste management services. Okay, you have a new customer. Why do I have to call someone? I can configure, the size of the bin, how often, give me a market-based price. So a lot of the things that are more, they're not the huge transactions, they're not everyday purchases, but they're meaningful enough that someone's going to do some searching. You have to have the ability to put that market-based price to make that decision quickly, because if someone else is out there and they can give that and it's fair, seems fair, the evidence shows that they're increasingly going to move towards those channels. So I would say, I think the future is moving towards where most businesses, for most of their transactions, are going to have the ability to go through the self-serve. Now, that doesn't mean that you don't want the ability to talk to a salesperson. And that's often the challenge. Okay, when they call, does the salesperson have that? Do they know what they saw on the website? So that omni-channel experience, we don't think everything's going to move purely to a no-touch self-service, but it's going to be more core to how buyers interact with the sellers going forward.
So on the positive note, the definitely positive note, the more I can push off to the buyer, meaning they're going to do their own research, they're going to figure out what it is that's going to go on. They don't need to talk to my salespeople, which are really expensive people to me. The more I can push that off to the buyer, the better off we're going to be as a seller.
Yeah, and this is driven, Mark, by the changes in the buyers. So for example, McKinsey and Company, they did a survey on kind of the purchasing process of B2B buyers. And there was a 79% increase in the importance of self-serve in the research and evaluation phase for B2B buyers, right? So a huge increase in the importance of that self-serve. So, and I think this gets to the fundamental change that we're seeing in the pricing profession. If you think of, you've been in pricing for a while, I've been doing it for 27 years. A lot of the work we did on pricing historically has been to gain control over a messy process, right? There was no courses in pricing, no frameworks, tools. And so for 20 plus years, companies have tried to control the process. And if you think about it, that's a management control problem that you're trying to solve. But the fundamental change here is pricing is now core to the customer experience, and customer experience is increasingly a basis of competition. So as a pricer, you need to be able to solve that and figure out, okay, what do the customers expect as part of their buying experience, and recognize that in the past they were willing to put up with this long drawn out process. They're no longer willing to put up with that, particularly for these repeat purchases and items that are not critically important as part of their cost of materials going forward, is to research and get that market level and market relevant prices immediately without going through this long process.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. But let's jump to the buyer side for a second and put ourselves in their shoes. As a buyer, when do I want to negotiate, and when do I want to trust that whatever price you gave me on your webpage is a good price?
Yeah, and I think a lot of that, I think that it's a great question, Mark. A lot of that comes from the confidence that the seller has in targeting that market relevant price, right? And the buyers, all the information that they're bringing in, how much agreement or how much do they believe that that's true? So, I get the question from some companies of, well, our customers put us through this long negotiation process, and they have purchasing groups and they do online bidding and all this. And the question I would ask them, and the statement I'd make is, usually they do that because they don't trust you, right? But if you're more transparent and you'd say, and we've seen this from our research, that you can explain our prices are set by an algorithm. We assess demand, our supply, competitive price, and that sets it. And increasingly buyers are okay with that. There's actually more objectivity in that than saying, okay, well, I think I can give you a discount. If you do that, then they're always thinking, okay, could I have gotten a better discount? Or what if I push them harder? And so there's this lack of trust in a quote negotiation that happens that's fundamental to many of the buyer and seller interactions. So I think to answer your question, from a buyer standpoint, I think it's, doing the research and saying, okay, is this a market relevant price? And maybe even probing the supplier, what is this price based on? And I think one of the changes that's going to happen is the sellers will have to be more transparent about how this price comes up and what is the basis of the algorithm. Historically on the B2B optimization side, the algorithms were more opaque. Now there's a need for those to be more transparent and actually sharing what's the basis of how these prices are being developed.
Okay, so I'm still not clear on this though. I like everything you're saying, but it's not overly clear. If I, as a buyer, am going to buy something that's, $100, I'm going to buy it at whatever the price is on the website, and I'm not going to care about it because I just want to get it off my plate and it's not worth any of my time. I'm going to go buy something that we're going to spend $1 million on this year, and you've given me a web price, and it says, oh, if I buy the quantity I want, it's going to be $1 million. Why wouldn't I say, oh, that's the starting point of the negotiation. Now I'm going to give the vendor a call.
Yeah, and you may do that. And I guess the question would be that $1 million, are you a multi-billion-dollar company and, that's, you've researched the price and the other price you see is close to that. I think it comes down to your perception as a buyer of how much disparity there is in the market. And then I think and I think that will happen. They will call the supplier, and the supplier has to be in a position to say, okay, are we going to under what circumstances are we going to have the ability to go further than that? And I think that's the trade-off of when you do that, are you going to open it up where now this is the starting point that goes, or do you have enough confidence in that price that you can justify it's $1 million because we know what the competitive price is, we know the supply is what it is, and the cost of delivering that service, and that's the price. And so, and I think the art comes into it of where do you set those boundaries? At what level are you willing to negotiate? And when you do negotiate, what are you going to negotiate from? Are you going to say, yes, I can give you a lower price if you do X, Y, and Z, or other avenues? So, I think that's where the art is going to come into it. I put out the statement of 15 to 20% should be in that high touch negotiation. I can tell you the companies that we're working with and are talking to, they have too much in, they have 80 to 90% in this negotiation process, and they want to aggressively move that. So it's going to shift, but it's going to take time. And I think that's going to be part of the strategic decisions and the art that's going to come into how you do that.
Yeah, I could see how there are probably some types of companies that could move this way pretty well. And then there are other companies, McKinsey is a great example, right? I don't know how they would ever do digitalized pricing.
Yeah, probably not.
Because every project's custom and every project's really expensive.
Yep.
So
and we're talking generalizations, but of course there are some cases where the big deals, you have 10 major customers and they're 5-year deals and they're very complicated and custom. So yeah, I'm making a generalization, but some companies, we know some companies that are moving, more towards 90 to 100% of those self-serve, non-negotiated prices, and some are, trying to just inch that up over time. But in general, we're seeing this trend across most B2B companies of trying to move towards this self-serve model more effectively.
Yeah, so I used to work in the semiconductor industry, and obviously some people could call a distributor and buy at whatever the price is that the distributor's selling it at. And so there was no negotiation, and that was awesome. But it was pretty common for them to ask the distributor for discounts, distributors to call our deal desk to ask for discounts, right? They had guidance on when they could or couldn't give discounts, but a ton of the business was transacted because people were negotiating prices, even if it wasn't a long drawn out negotiation. It was stuff that could have and should have been automated.
Yeah, and I agree. And a lot of that, and we see a lot of movement in distribution to try to change that in those, kind of low invoice level, high velocity environments where they're trying to automate that and saying, this is crazy. Why do we have this complicated process? Why can't we just have more confidence? And part of it comes into, if you look at most B2B companies and you do a scatter plot of price and volume of transactions, a lot of those companies still have those customers that walk in, okay, that's the list price. Okay, I'm in a hurry, I need to get it. And so there's this perceived risk that, okay, I don't want to lose that, right? And so I think the strategic decision comes into, okay, how much does that actually represent? And what are you going to gain by having a more market relevant price out there? And maybe lose that umbrella price that you've had in the past. And I think and the experience that we have of the customers that have made that leap to say, okay, we're going to get much more benefit by being, very targeted and relevant, maybe more dynamic. We're going to move price more over time, but we're not going to rely on that high price umbrella out there, have seen tremendous benefit in doing that just due to the velocity, this more simplified process that it provides.
Okay, so I'm gonna completely drink the Kool-Aid with you, Craig, and I think that really high-end deals are going to be negotiated. Low-end deals obviously are going to be automated, and in the middle, that's where it's kind of questionable. We're trying to figure it all out, and that price level should be moving up and up and up over time, where we get more and more of those deals, let's say, automated as opposed to negotiated. And so I'll buy that Kool-Aid completely. You've used the words market relevant price a lot. How do I find a market relevant price?
Yeah, and that's I think that relates to the question you asked before about the volatility that's happening. And, we see all of the traditional things you think about as influencing price of the competitive price that's out there, the supply demand situation. So do you have supply and competitors don't, or is it trending towards you're going to run out of supply? What's your cost? Obviously, is that moving up and down? And then what's the behavior of customers in the past? So when you've, all of those things taken to get together, what have they paid in the past? How do you interpret that information? So all of those things are still relevant. And the reason I use that term a lot is because, like I said, a lot of B2B companies rely on this, huge band of prices that are out there, and the list price. Okay, that's the starting point, and then we're trying to capture every piece of the demand curve out there. And I think market relevant means that you need to figure out, okay, how do you want to capture that in a more systematic way using data a priori to figure out that price, as opposed to a lot of that scatter that's happened in the past. When you look at it empirically, a lot of it was a result of things you couldn't explain. It was some salespeople were better negotiators than others. Some made mistakes. You want to try to get rid of all that stuff and make it more clear on what's determining the price and having confidence that that's a market relevant price, as opposed to relying on this widely varying differences in negotiation ability that's happening. So I would say all the traditional things that most pricers know that influence those price, all of those things are the same. The challenge often is, how do you systematize that? How do you get that information? How do you build the models to say how you're going to react to it? How do you determine different levels of aggressiveness? So you don't have perfect data. So sometimes you're exploring, how much of a premium, how much of a margin over cost should I be getting if you're a distributor? And you may be testing those different levels over time. So it's, I would say all the traditional things that you think about apply, and it's a question of how you make that more systematic in determining those prices.
Yeah, I don't know about you, but I would find that absolutely fun to try to figure that out. What data do we have? How can we predict what people are willing to pay?
That's what we do.
That's where the game is played. That's where the game is played. So, Craig, I think we're almost out of time today, but I'll ask and see if you give us a different answer than last time. What's one piece of pricing advice you'd give our listeners that you think could have a big impact on their business?
So the big piece of price advice that I would give is, I think it relates to my comment around viewing pricing as less of a management control issue and more of a customer experience issue. So the advice that I would give is, within your pricing group, your organization, think about the customer experience and how price plays into it, and how do you innovate on that? How do you deliver prices more quickly, more relevant to the market? How do you move towards this no-touch self-service more aggressively? Because our belief, and we see it, is those companies that do that, that's going to be a basis of competition. And a lot of companies are going through digital transformations, but they're not focusing on the pricing issue and relying too much on this, high list price umbrella that's out there. So think of your role from a customer experience standpoint, and your role of how you deliver price in that, I think would be my one piece of advice going forward.
Nice. And you guys just put on a conference. Actually, you're going to in the future, but we're going to play this after it's been on. So could you mention it for the listeners, please?
Sure. Pros, we're putting on our Annual Outperform Conference. We have 60 plus speakers, and we're talking, the theme of the conference is around self-serve, digital selling, the role of price in there. So we have over 60 speakers talking about various topics. We will have the sessions available to view after the fact. So I would encourage you to look at the agenda. We'll put a link to that, and any of the sessions that are of interest to you. Hopefully it would help in the knowledge building in that area. So appreciate the time.
Excellent. And Craig, thank you so much for your time today. If anybody wants to contact you, how can they do that?
My email address is czawada@pros.com. So I think you'll provide a link in there and be happy to answer any questions and be in contact with any of the listeners. So appreciate all you do, Mark, on the podcast. Thank you.
Oh, I appreciate it. It's fun. Episode 95, all done. To our listeners, would you please leave us a review? These are very, very valuable to us. And I promise I'm going to read them online if you do. Chris McKinsey said, provocative and insightful. This is not an area I fully get. This cast helped me understand more about dynamic pricing, which is surely the future. And Craig would probably agree with that too. Please join the community at championsofvalue.com. That's where we publish all of the content I put out for free, the memes, the blogs, the videos, the podcasts. You'll find that at community.championsofvalue.com. If you have any questions or comments about the podcast or pricing in general, feel free to email me, mark@impactpricing.com. Now, go make an impact.